We're back with another episode of Mac Stories Unwind, the show that's all about the picks. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Happy Friday, Federico.
Hello, John, and happy Friday to you as well. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Let's dive right into our picks today. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to jump in here?
No, I'll go first this time.
All right, cool.
I have a pick that I am so happy about this pick that it exists, and I still actually cannot believe that I finally get to talk about this game that, I've been anticipating for a long time. So my pick this week is, unsurprisingly, I would say Metroid Prime Remastered.
Yes,
So
it's a
this
very teachy pick.
This is the ultimate. Well, no, maybe not the ultimate teachy pick.
It's close.
It's close. There's other picks that could be the ultimate teachy picks. I mean, Wind Waker HD or a remaster of Final Fantasy Tactics, which I'll get to in a minute, by the way.
Okay.
But yes, so Metroid Prime Remastered. This is just came out a few days ago on the Nintendo Switch, and it was surprise dropped by Nintendo at the end of a Nintendo Direct last week. So, talking about Metroid Prime Remastered, I mean, it's a bit challenging because there's so much context surrounding this game. So I'll try my best.
Okay.
Metroid Prime Remastered came out originally on the Nintendo GameCube in November 2002 in the US. I believe it launched in Europe at some point in early 2003, I want to say. In any case, it's a game that I first played and finished 20 years ago on the Nintendo GameCube. Metroid Prime Remastered, Metroid Prime at the time, the original, it was a big deal. After a couple of false starts with bringing the world of Metroid to 3D with the Nintendo GameCube, I remember, and maybe I'll find it somewhere, that Nintendo had shown off like first concept or demo of Metroid Prime, and a lot of people were not convinced by it. This was a major departure for the Metroid series. And here the historical context, I think, is necessary. Before Metroid Prime, the last official showing of Metroid on Nintendo consoles was with Super Metroid on the Super Nintendo in 1994. So
Wow.
a full 8 years before Metroid Prime. And it was a 2D scrolling action-adventure game. And Super
Right.
Metroid was the game that effectively sort of created the genre known as Metroidvania. Meaning these action-adventure games, based on Metroid, based on the Castlevania series, where you have a huge sprawling map and you need to explore this map and fight enemies and fight bosses and collect weapon upgrades and other artifacts. And one of the distinctive traits of Super Metroid was this incredibly huge map. Great music, great atmosphere, but also the idea of backtracking, as with you control Samus Aran, a space soldier of some kind of the Galactic Federation, and you needed to collect all these weapon upgrades, and there's a whole story and lore that I don't want to get into for this episode. But in any case, when Nintendo announced we are going to bring back Metroid and do a 3D game, and we are going to have it be developed by Retro Studios, it was a big deal because nobody knew what to expect.
It's interesting to me that they skipped over the N64 entirely, which I guess makes, the GameCube version even more kind of shocking and different from looking back all the way to the Super Nintendo.
It was a shock. I remember reading on video game magazines at the time, and it was really a shock to go from a 2D scrolling action-adventure game to a first-person shooter, which is basically what Metroid Prime was and is. It looks like a first-person shooter. Now, it's important to contextualize the world of first-person shooters at the time. The original Metroid Prime was not the kind of first-person shooter that you may expect today. At the time, 20 years ago, the idea of twin-stick control for first-person shooters was, on consoles, a novel idea. And I believe that Halo was the original Halo on the original Xbox was the first game that pioneered the idea of a twin stick control for games on consoles. Obviously, on PC, PC gamers had long been able to move the character and move the camera independently for many years using the WASD controls and the mouse. Obviously, on consoles, I think at the time, video game developers were a little unsure whether people would be able to grasp the idea of using a stick to move and another stick to move the camera and another button to shoot, which is why the original Metroid Prime on GameCube was not a twin stick controlled first-person shooter. It had this weird control system where basically you could move with the left stick on the GameCube, but if you wanted to aim, you needed to stand still and use the L trigger to aim.
Weird.
You couldn't walk and aim freely at the same time. It was kind of like a Resident Evil game, but it was weird. I kind of liked it at the time, but now, of course, 20 years later, I can see why that control system was not ideal. And the thing that really stood out about Metroid Prime was that it was about the first-person shooting and exploration, but really it was more about the adventure and exploring this beautiful alien planet, Talon 4. You control Samus Aran and you land on this alien planet, and you realize that there was this huge apocalypse that involved a great poison that destroyed the planet and the previous civilization that lived on the planet, the Chozo. Now, this planet turns out, again, one of the things that Metroid Prime sort of pioneered was this idea of there's no story that is told to you with cutscenes or really like characters. You piece together the story piece by piece by scanning the environment and by collecting these logs and these like bits of information from abandoned computer stations and abandoned labs. And you start putting together the story like that. It's not told to you. You progressively discover the story. Now, of course, over the years, this will become a staple of the video game industry, this method of storytelling. You may have seen this like in later in games like BioShock, for example, and now like the idea of collecting logs and scanning the environment is everywhere. I mean, you look at Horizon games, for example, you collect logs and you scan recordings and diaries that you find. And
Tomb Raider does that. A whole bunch of games.
A whole bunch of games do that. And Metroid Prime was sort of the first to do it in a 3D environment. And so it was not necessarily about the shooting part, although shooting in Metroid Prime was fun because you had all these different kinds of weapons and all these weapon upgrades, and each weapon would do something different in terms of how it would interact with the environment. It was really fun, and you didn't have like real guns, for example, but you had these different types of beam, and then Samus could turn into a morph ball, and then you could use the double jump. I remember playing Metroid Prime at the time and thinking, this is unlike anything I've ever played. The atmosphere, the music, just the general sense of an evocative game that really made you feel like a lone explorer on an alien planet inhabited by creatures that were out to kill you. And that sense of atmosphere of being alone on an alien planet was done so well in the original Metroid Prime, and that's why it became it still is one of my all-time favorite video games that I've ever played in my life. Of course, later came Metroid Prime 2 Echoes and Metroid Prime 3 Corruption, and Nintendo eventually did Metroid Prime Trilogy on the Nintendo Wii, and the Trilogy version, although graphically speaking, had some things actually done worse than the GameCube port. At the very least, it enabled the motion controls for moving and aiming at the same time using the Wiimote and the nunchuck controller. Then after Metroid Prime Trilogy in 2006, nothing. We never got a Metroid Prime Trilogy port for the Nintendo Wii U, and we've been waiting forever for a Metroid Prime Trilogy to come back in some capacity to the Nintendo Switch. Of course, Nintendo came back with Metroid Dread in 2021, But that was a return to the roots of the series. It was a 2D scrolling action adventure game. So Metroid Prime Remastered, it's incredible because I think it's actually more than a remaster of the original Metroid Prime. Really, it kind of is a remake of the first Metroid Prime. I've been playing over the years on and off the original Metroid Prime for GameCube with the Dolphin emulator, with the upscaling mode to increase the resolution, and with custom AI-generated HD texture packs. We talked about this on Unwind before. This on the Switch looks better than Metroid Prime, the original one, upscaled to 4K with HD texture packs. And that's because the entire game has been redone. The geometry, the lighting, the movement, everything has been redone, graphically speaking. I believe Nintendo, what they did, and actually Retro Studio collaborated with another developer to do this, they kept the original physics and AI of the enemies, but the entire world has been redrawn, basically from scratch, keeping the same layout, keeping the same underlying geometry. But the thing about comparing, and you can go to YouTube, and it's tricky to talk about this on a podcast rather than actually seeing the comparison in action. So my recommendation would be go to YouTube and search for Metroid Prime compared to Metroid Prime Remastered, and you will see that even if you upscale the original game and even if you bring in custom textures, you cannot do what Retro Studios did here, which is actually draw new elements and have more details in the trees and the caves and the buildings. This Metroid Prime Remastered is, John, when you say, it's an expression that we hear often. Like when you play an old game, like a remake of an old game, and your brain tricks you like, oh, this is the game how I remember it.
Right.
But then if you actually go back and try to play the original game, you realize, oh no, this looks terrible.
Yeah, this is not as good as I remember because it's a totally different experience in a modern world, right?
Metroid Prime Remastered looks like how I remember Metroid Prime, but when you compare it side by side, it's obviously so much better.
Right. That's great.
I am loving this game. I'm almost, I want to say, like 10 hours into the game, approaching the halfway point, I think. And it's so funny because the first section of Metroid Prime, I started many times over the years. So the first few areas I remember pretty well. But now I've reached the point where, even with the emulators, I never got that far into Metroid Prime. And so now what I'm doing is fighting enemies and exploring areas that I last explored 20 years ago. And I remember nothing of this game. Like the first few areas, I remember where the items are, where the upgrades are, where the hidden doors are. But now, where I'm at in the game, I don't remember. I don't remember anything because I last played it 20 years ago.
Yeah.
This remastered version, of course, comes with multiple control systems. You can choose the original GameCube control method, which I didn't pick.
I was going to say, I wouldn't recommend that really.
No. You can play with motion controls if you want, or you can just use the regular twin stick control system. And the thing is, the last thing I will say about this game, it holds up exceptionally well compared to modern video games. The storytelling, the atmosphere, the music, the physics, how jumping in a first-person shooter game, and especially double jumping, never feels as good and realistic as it does in Metroid Prime. And I don't know, there's so much that I wish that I could encapsulate the beauty and the sheer atmosphere in Metroid Prime Remastered in 14 minutes that I've been talking. It's impossible. If you love Metroid Prime, go play this one. And the last thing I will say is this. I was just listening to the latest episode of the Triple Click podcast. Excellent video game.
I saw they have a new episode about this game. I haven't listened to it yet.
And at the very end of the episode, Jason Schreier just casually dropped, you just wait for some more remasters this year, including Final Fantasy Tactics.
Really?
And Final Fantasy Tactics, an HD remaster was leaked. Do you remember that NVIDIA server leaked from a couple of years ago? Yeah. And apparently it's always been real. and it's coming out this year. Metroid Prime Remastered, Jason said, was ready in 2021. It just sat on the shelf for an
Wow.
entire year for whatever
Oh my
reason.
gosh.
And so, I am curious to see what Nintendo's going to do with Metroid Prime 2 and 3. Are those games going to get the same treatment of Metroid Prime 1, or will Nintendo just port the originals on the Nintendo eShop? We'll see. But in the meantime, I am incredibly happy about Metroid Prime Remastered. It looks fantastic. It plays fantastic. I love this game.
Yeah, it's a fantastic game. I've played a little bit of it. I haven't gotten as nearly as far as you have, but I was just amazed when I started it up as to how nice it is. I mean, this is like playing modern Metroid. I really enjoyed the opening scenes and the first levels, and have been playing through it. So yeah, I'm gonna be spending more time with this in the coming weeks. My pick today is a TV show. I've been really enjoying Shrinking, which is an Apple TV Plus show. Jennifer and I have been watching this, and when I first saw, I think, kind of like the promos for this early on, I was kind of unsure of it. You know, it had big names in it. It's got Jason Segel and it's got Harrison Ford, and a story though about therapists that was a comedy struck me as kind of odd. And this really is an odd show, but odd in a very good way, because it's at its heart, it's really a story about like people's everyday struggles and dealing with the grief in particular, you know, deaths and families and things like that. And you would think that that would be very hard to make into a comedy, but it's kind of that tension and the drama surrounding those harder topics in life that create room for some comedic relief and works really particularly well. This is from the team that put together Ted Lasso. And in some ways, it's the opposite of Ted Lasso. It comes at comedy and kind of a feel-good story from the opposite end of the spectrum. Whereas, you know, Ted Lasso is very much starts from a place of optimism. Whereas in Shrinking, the first thing you see, first person you meet is Jimmy, played by Jason Segel, who is a dad of a teenage daughter who has lost his wife. And he's not really pulled himself out of the grief surrounding her death. And, you know, he's seen patients and works with two other therapists who are played by Harrison Ford, who is Paul, and Gabby, who's a younger woman who's also a therapist. And they've all got problems in their own lives that they're dealing with at the same time they're trying to help their patients. And the thing about Jimmy is that, you know, he is so deep in a funk and in his own grief that one day he's meeting with one of his patients and he just decides, you know, instead of kind of doing the back and forth dialogue about how do you feel about this? What do you think you should do? He just tells a woman, you should leave your husband. He's a jerk. He's a terrible person. Just leave him. Go visit your sister and wherever and leave. And which you know, Paul, who is his coworker, is played by Harrison Ford, is just aghast at, because it's just like not by the book for therapists to do that kind of thing. But, you know, it turns out that it kind of works. And this woman actually ends up being happy after she leaves her abusive husband. And then he kind of keeps at it and does the same thing with a young kid who has come back from Afghanistan and has PTSD and anger problems. You know, he gets in fights all the time. He gets arrested. He gets kicked out of his house, and Jimmy takes him in, and he's living in the pool house at Jimmy's house, and kind of becomes part of his family. And so there's these interesting dynamics between the therapists and their patients, but also between Jimmy and his daughter, who have kind of grown apart because of the loss of the mother and wife, as well as relationships with the coworkers and Jimmy's neighbors, who are really well done. There's a mom next door who has really taken the daughter under her wing and has both helped but also hurt in a lot of ways, in the sense that she's really almost taken over the role of being the mom for this young teenage daughter and caused some of the separation between Jimmy and his daughter, while at the same time kind of helping this girl through her, high school years. So it's there's a lot of different characters. It's one of those shows that I think you really have to watch a few episodes of to really get a sense for who these characters are and to really have them, develop to a point where you understand kind of their motivations and the comedy really starts kicking in. But it's been on, I think, 5 or 6 episodes so far. It's still going. There are at least a handful of episodes more, and it's become one of our favorites. I mean, we've sat down and watched this every Friday night when a new episode comes out, and so I highly recommend it. All right, Federico. Well, that's a couple of great picks for the weekend, everybody. Enjoy Metroid Prime and Shrinking. We will be back next week with another episode of Mac Stories Unwind. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. We're on Mastodon, where you can easily follow us by going to either vitici.macstories.net, where you will find Federico's profile and be able to click follow to follow him on Mastodon, or johnvorhees.macstories.net to do the same thing for me. And we're on Instagram, where Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI, and I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.